Okay, in this video we're going to talk about feeler gauges. We think that it's a pretty straightforward lesson, so we only have one real question for discussion here. What is another instrument or gauge we have discussed that might be used if feeler gauges are not readily available? Discuss the pros and cons of each.
Well, depending how easy it is to get to the gap that we're trying to measure, because usually feeler gauges are used to determine the length of a gap that there is, I would perhaps use some calipers. So I would try to measure one side of the gap, the other side of the gap, and see how far it is. But the problem, as you can see with calipers, look at the size of this instrument. It's going to be very difficult perhaps to get inside of the hood of a car and get this to fit in between all the hose and everything and try to measure that distance. So we're really at a disadvantage if it's a tight spot that we have to measure.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. And in one of the other lessons in this learning objective, depending on what order you're taking them, there is something called gauge pins that could be an alternative if you don't have shim stock lying around. And gauge pins are just pins of very, very, very precise diameter. So here are a couple of gauge pins right here. And these are, they typically will come in a set. And so you might have like 100 gauge pins that come in a set. And the gauge pins are increments of like 1/1000th of an inch. So you might have a set of...
Can we show the set?
Oh, yeah.
So check this out, guys.
Okay,
we have a set here.
Set of gauge pins. Yep, you see all these different gauge pins there. So for example, now shim stock is usually pretty thin, right? You're talking about, maybe 10/1000ths of an inch or less. So this right here is a gauge pin that is 11.5 thousandths of an inch. So 0.0115 thousandths of an inch. And usually the gauge pins don't get much thinner than this. And you can certainly have shim stock that's more than 10/1000ths of an inch. I didn't mean to indicate that's the thickest that they would go. But gauge pins can be an alternative to using some shim stock as well.
So can gauge pins be used for, is it only for circular places that you're trying to determine? Or could it be used for two surfaces like this? And you can put the gauge pin in there.
Yeah, great question. You can absolutely use it for this situation that you've drawn out here. In fact, we had an application recently for, think about like pliers, right? You know how pliers have like jaws at the end like that, and then they're handles, and so you squeeze the handle and the jaws come together. So there's a medical device that we're working on that had jaws that were kind of like this, but they were much more sophisticated than just your pliers jaws. And these jaws had a little track that ran in them. So let's say that this is looking in this direction at one of the jaws. Here's the kind of the profile of the jaws, and there's a little track in here. And there's a blade that moves back and forth in that track. And we needed to measure the width of that track. And calipers are kind of too small to be to get in there and make a reliable measurement. So we used a gauge pin. And we dropped it in this orientation and moved it back and forth until we found one that just barely fit in there and allowed us to move it back and forth.
But how do you know that you're putting the gauge pin at exact no angle? Like if you're putting it at an angle, of course it's going to make contact first, it's going to get stuck. But if you put it straight up and down, there may be some more room. How do you know? It's
kind of by feel, so you drop it in at first and you kind of let it float a little bit just in your hand. Move it around just a little bit. I'm exaggerating it, but it's just by feel. You can definitely feel when it drops in at no angle, and then you can move it back and forth.
So really you're saying that you can replace feeler gauges with gauge pins? Is that correct? You don't need both to have in the shop?
I wouldn't say that, not all the time. In fact, let me get something else. So we just bought a new 3D printer here at Pipeline, and it's by a company called Mark Forged. They make this really cool 3D printer that inlays carbon fiber. But when it arrived, there was a calibration process that we had to go through. And in this 3D printer, there are two printing nozzles through which filament is extruded in order to create the 3D print. And here's the same term, the relative height between those two nozzles is really important to get good prints. And if it's not set just right, and we're talking about probably within maybe 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, so like a really tight tolerance between the relative heights of those two nozzles. If it's not set just right, your print is not going to turn out very nicely. So the company supplied these shim stock to customers that purchase the machine, and you use these shim stock to like insert underneath the nozzle head and make sure that it's the height is set correctly. And you wouldn't be able to do this with a gauge pin because you have to kind of reach a little bit further into the machine than you could access with, you know, a short gauge pin. So they give you these long shim stock that, you know, you have more length to kind of reach it, extend it into the location that you need to measure.
So these actually came with the 3D printing machine?
Mm-hmm. Yep, they did.
Why would they need to send you these if they just shipped you the 3D printing machine? Shouldn't it already be calibrated, or something could happen to it along with when it was shipped?
Yeah, something could happen when it's shipped. I mean, we're talking about, you know, 1/1000th of an inch, or I don't know, maybe 2 thousandths of an inch, but very, very small amounts, and just based on the potentially aggressive nature of shipping, it could get knocked around. So
These are feeler gauges, right?
that's right. Yeah, that's a good point. We've been talking about shim stock, even though the lesson is called feeler gauges, and they're more or less the same thing. Shim stock might come in different shapes, like you might have shim stock that looks like a washer, you know, it's kind of a ring shape, or you might have larger sheets of shim stock, like 6 by 6 inches, whereas feeler gauges are usually more this shape. They're long and skinny, maybe not necessarily always this long, but there's like usually rectangular in shape, and there's definitely a long side and a short side. It really just comes down to the shape of it. But feeler gauges and shim stock kind of used for, at least they can be used for the same thing.
All right, sounds good.
If you found this content helpful, consider enrolling in our signature program at mypipelineacademy.com. Whether you're an individual interested in beginning a new career as a mechanical designer or a company interested in training your new engineering hires, our signature program helps students develop the practical skills they need to be productive mechanical design engineers. Seating is limited. We hope to see you there soon.